I held my breath as the midwife handed me my newborn son. My husband, David, leaned in with a proud golden boy smile, ready to meet his heir. But as the blanket fell away, the room went ice cold. He stared at the baby's dark skin, his perfect world shattering in a single heartbeat. He thought the kidnapping on our wedding day was just a harmless game. He was dead wrong. The morning air tasted of sterile lilies and the chemical bite of expensive hairspray. I stared at my reflection in the floor-to-ceiling mirror, a woman encased in layers of ivory silk that felt more like a shroud than a celebration. My skin looked unnaturally pale against the shimmering fabric, making me appear like a ghost haunting my own dressing room. Everything was too perfect, too curated. I was merely a prop in a high-budget production of a life I had never truly chosen for myself, waiting for the first act to begin in the frozen silence of my gilded cage. Outside the heavy oak doors of the estate, the Chicago summer melted the pavement with a relentless humid intensity. Inside the mansion, however, the air conditioning hummed with a low mechanical drone that kept the atmosphere as cold as a mausoleum. I could feel the weight of my grandmother's pearls pressing against my throat, a cold reminder of the traditions I was expected to uphold. Every breath felt shallow and deliberate, as if the very air had been filtered until all the life was sucked out of it, leaving only a scentless and clinical void. David stepped into the room with the practiced grace of a man who had never known a day of true uncertainty. His golden hair was styled to a degree of perfection that felt aggressive, and his smile carried the polished sheen of a luxury car advertisement. He approached me with a proprietary air, his footsteps silent on the thick Persian rug that muffled the world. When he leaned down to kiss my bare shoulder, I found myself flinching at the sudden, biting cold of his lips against my heated skin, a sensation that sent a shiver of dread down my spine. He told me I looked breathtaking, but his eyes remained focused on the way the light hit the diamond at my throat rather than the fatigue in my gaze. At 25 years old, I was exactly where the world told me I should be, standing on the precipice of a union that defined success in our social circles. There were no rough edges in David's world, no unscripted moments or raw emotions that could not be smoothed over with a checkbook. I nodded in silent agreement, playing the role of the blushing bride while the true version of myself remained buried deep inside. From the grand staircase below, the sounds of the traditional bride price began to rise like a rowdy stage tide of masculine bravado. David's friends, a collection of golden boys in tailored tuxedos, were shouting jokes and demanding their right to see the bride with practiced boisterous energy. It was a pantomime of tradition, a noisy performance of capturing the prize that lacked any real sense of stakes or danger. I stood in the center of the drawing room, surrounded by the floral arrangements that cost more than most people earned in a single year. The smell of expensive champagne and cloying perfume began to fill the room as the guests crowded the doorways to witness the spectacle. I felt like a porcelain doll placed on a pedestal, watched by eyes that saw only the brand names and the pedigree. The laughter was too loud, the toasts were too frequent, and the forced merriment felt like a physical pressure against my temples. I reached for a glass of water, my fingers trembling slightly, but I forced a smile for the photographer whose camera flashed like a rhythmic, blinding pulse in the corner of my eye. Suddenly, the crystal chandeliers overhead flickered with a sharp, electric pop that momentarily plunged the ornate room into a jarring, unnatural gray. The laughter died down for a fraction of a heartbeat, replaced by a heavy, expectant silence that felt far more honest than the previous noise. My skin prickled with a sudden intuition, a primitive alarm bell ringing somewhere deep within the marrow of my bones. In that brief window of shadow, the air seemed to thicken, losing its climate-controlled chill and gaining a heavy electric charge that smelled of an approaching storm. Before the lights could fully regain their brilliance, a massive gloved hand clamped firmly over my mouth, cutting off my breath and my ability to scream. The scent hit me instantly, a raw, intoxicating mixture of worn leather, expensive tobacco, and the ozone of a summer rainstorm. It was a smell that belonged to a different life, a scent that carried the weight of 1,000 childhood secrets and whispered promises. The grip was iron-strong and unyielding, pulling my head back against a chest that felt as solid and immovable as a mountain of dark granite. I was being dragged toward the side exit, my heavy silk train hissing across the hardwood floors like a dying snake. The world of David and the lilies became a blurred smear of white and gold as I was pulled into the dim hallway. My captor moved with a predatory, silent efficiency that made the boisterous groomsmen in the other room seem like children playing at war. I felt the heat radiating from his body through the thin fabric of my gown, a searing contrast to the artificial winter of the house that made my head spin with a dizzying, terrifying vertigo. As we crossed the threshold of the servants' entrance, I looked down and saw a single gold cufflink lying on the floor, abandoned and forgotten. It was David's, engraved with his family crest, but now it lay there crushed beneath the heavy mud-stained tread of a combat boot. The sight of that broken piece of jewelry sent a jolt of electricity through my spine, a realization that the order of my life had been irrevocably shattered. I did not struggle against the arms that held me. Instead, I felt a treacherous dark relief blooming in the center of my chest. Just before we reached the waiting darkness of the driveway, I caught one final glimpse of myself in the long mirror of the vestibule. Behind my pale, wide-eyed reflection loomed a massive shadow, a silhouette so tall and powerful it seemed to swallow the light. I could not see his face, but I knew the shape of those shoulders and the way he held me, as if I were the only thing in the world worth stealing. The door slammed shut behind us, cutting off the sound of the wedding, leaving only the sound of my own heart thundering in the sudden, humid silence of the night. The black SUV tore through the humid Illinois night like a jagged blade slicing through thick, black velvet. Behind the tinted windows, the world I had known for 25 years vanished into a blur of streetlights and dying suburban dreams. I sat in the shadows of the back seat, my breathing ragged and shallow, listening to the predatory hum of the engine as it devoured the miles between us and the life I was supposed to lead. The silence inside the cabin was heavy, pressurized by a tension that felt more like a physical weight than a mere lack of conversation, and I could feel my pulse thundering against the base of my throat like a trapped bird. A piece of my lace veil was caught in the heavy door, a white, tattered ghost fluttering desperately against the metal as we gained speed on the open highway. I made no move to free it, watching through the glass as the delicate fabric was whipped into a frenzy by the wind until it looked like a frantic, dying thing. It was a fitting symbol for the wedding I had just fled, a fragile illusion of purity that was being torn apart by the raw power of the machine carrying me away. The ivory silk of my dress felt cold and restrictive against my skin, a costume for a play that had been abruptly cancelled by the man sitting just a few feet in front of me. I stared at the back of his head, tracing the powerful line of his shoulders, and the way his hands gripped the steering wheel with a terrifying, calm authority. Marcus did not look back at me, his attention fixed entirely on the road ahead, as if the act of driving was the only thing keeping the world from spinning off its axis. He was a mountain of obsidian and resolve, dressed in a suit that spoke of boardrooms and power, yet he carried the aura of a man who was still comfortable in the shadows of the streets. The low light from the dashboard illuminated the edge of his jaw, sharp enough to cut, and the stillness of his profile made my chest tighten with a familiar dread. The air inside the vehicle was saturated with the scent of expensive tobacco, and a specific bitter perfume that acted as a key to a door I had kept locked for 7 long years. It was the smell of our last summer together, a season of sweltering heat and whispered promises made in the tall grass behind the suburban fences of our youth. That aroma was a haunting reminder of the boy who had shared his headphones with me, while we hid from the world, dreaming of an escape that had finally arrived in the most violent and unexpected way. It was a fragrance that did not belong in David's sterile world, and its presence here felt like an act of war against my reality. I remembered the way David used to speak of him, his voice dripping with an inherited arrogance that never failed to make my stomach turn in silent protest. He called Marcus a lucky parvenu, a man who had forced his way into circles where he did not belong through sheer, brute force ambition and questionable connections. David never understood that the very thing he despised was what had once made my heart beat faster than any of his rehearsed compliments ever could. To David, he was a threat to the social order. To me, he was the only person who had ever truly seen the cracks in the porcelain mask I wore for my family. Now that same man was my kidnapper. The highway lights flickered across his face in rhythmic intervals, revealing a gaze that was as cold and deep as a winter lake hidden in the woods. We were passing the industrial fringes of the city now, where the skeletons of old factories stood like giant, rusted sentinels against the bruised purple of the night sky. The smooth pavement gave way to the rhythmic thumping of uneven asphalt, a jarring sensation that vibrated through the floorboards and up into the soles of my feet. I could feel the heat of the engine through the leather of the seat, a low-frequency rumble that seemed to synchronize with the frantic rhythm of my own heart as we drove. My fear, which had been a sharp and icy thing in the drawing room, was slowly beginning to transform into something far more dangerous and intoxicating. It was a thick, syrupy recognition that flowed through my veins, replacing my panic with a heavy sense of inevitability that I could no longer ignore. I knew the way he tilted his head when he was thinking, and I knew the silent language of his stillness better than I knew the man I had intended to marry. This was not a stranger taking me into the night. This was the ghost of my past coming to claim what had always belonged to him. The realization was a jagged shard of glass cutting through my denial. We had grown up on the edge of two worlds, separated only by a narrow strip of parkland that felt like a vast, uncrossable ocean to everyone but us. I could still see the boy he used to be, lean and watchful, standing under the shadow of the old oak tree where we used to meet after the streetlights came on. He had always been the one to listen while I complained about the suffocating expectations of my parents and the colorless future they had mapped out for me. We were two halves of a whole that did not fit into the suburban puzzle, bonded by a shared resentment and a hunger for something that was not served at country club luncheons. The interior of the SUV was a sanctuary of dark leather and brushed steel, a mobile fortress that isolated us from the rest of the judgmental world. There were no family photos on the dashboard, no trinkets or signs of a soft life, only the functional elegance of a man who moved through the world with singular purpose. I reached out a hand, my fingers brushing against the cool, smooth surface of the armrest, feeling the subtle vibrations of the high-performance machine beneath me. It was a stark contrast to David's vintage convertible, which always felt like a fragile toy meant for Sunday drives and shallow conversations. This vehicle was built for secrets. The city lights were a fading memory now, replaced by the long, lonely stretches of road where the darkness seemed to press against the glass with a physical weight. We were traveling deep into the forgotten pockets of the county, where the grass grew tall and unruly, and the neon signs of distant gas stations flickered like dying stars. I watched the silhouette of a water tower pass by, a silver giant standing guard over a town that probably did not even have a name on the map. The isolation was beginning to set in, a profound sense of being untethered from my own life, and cast into a void where the only constant was the silent man behind the wheel. Marcus still had not spoken a single word, and the silence between us grew until it was almost deafening in its complexity. It was not the awkward silence of a first date or the comfortable quiet of old friends, but a loaded, tactical stillness that demanded my total attention. Every time he shifted gears or adjusted his grip, the sound of his movements seemed amplified in the small space, drawing my eyes back to the play of muscles in his forearms. I found myself wondering what he was thinking, if he felt the same electric pull that was currently threatening to short-circuit my nervous system. He was a master of self-control, and I was merely a passenger. We used to swear that we would never become like our parents, trapped in the amber of routine and the quiet desperation of polite society. I had failed that promise the moment I accepted David's ring, choosing the safety of a predictable cage over the uncertainty of a life lived on my own terms. Marcus, however, had kept his word in the most spectacular and ruthless way possible, carving a path through the world that left no room for compromise. He had become the very thing they feared, a man with nothing to lose and the resources to take whatever he wanted. As I sat in the back of his car, I realized that I was the final piece of his long-awaited rebellion. The car began to slow down as we approached a flickering sign that stood at the end of a long gravel driveway, its red neon letters buzzing with a sickly hum. The words Azure Palms were barely legible, and the building behind the sign was a low, weather-beaten structure that looked like it had not seen a guest in 3 decades. This was the kind of place where people came to disappear, a forgotten relic of the roadside era that had been swallowed by the encroaching forest. The tires crunched over the loose stones, a sound like breaking bones in the stillness of the night, as we pulled into the shadows of the farthest unit. Marcus cut the engine. For several minutes, neither of us moved, and the only sound was the ticking of the cooling engine and the distant chirping of crickets in the tall weeds. I could see the outline of his shoulders rise and fall with a deep, controlled breath as he finally turned off the headlights, plunging us into total darkness. The air inside the car began to grow warm and stagnant without the air conditioning, and the smell of tobacco and rain seemed to intensify in the close quarters. My heart was pounding so hard against my ribs that I was certain he could hear it, a frantic drumbeat that betrayed my outward appearance of calm. I waited for him to finally end the silence. He finally moved, the leather of his seat creaking as he turned to look at me for the very first time since he had snatched me from my own wedding. Even in the dim light, his eyes were 2 points of cold fire, burning with an intensity that made me want to shrink back and lean forward all at once. He did not look like a kidnapper, nor did he look like the boy I used to know. He looked like a man who had waited an eternity for this specific moment. His hand reached over the back of the seat, his long fingers hovering just inches from the edge of my silk skirt, and the air between us seemed to vibrate with an invisible, dangerous current of electricity. "Open the door, Emily," he said, and his voice was a low, resonant growl that seemed to vibrate through the very seat I was sitting on. It was the first time I had heard him speak my name in years, and the sound of it made a strange hot ache bloom in the pit of my stomach. I obeyed without question, my fingers fumbling with the heavy door handle until the humid night air rushed in to greet me like a long-lost friend. The smell of damp earth and rotting leaves was a shock to my system after the sterile environment of the estate, grounding me in a reality that felt far more visceral. I stepped out onto the gravel, the sharp stones biting into my heels. Marcus stepped out of the driver's side, his massive frame dwarfing the car as he walked around to stand in front of me, a shadow that blotted out the stars. He did not touch me yet, but his presence was a physical force that I could feel against my skin, warmer than the summer night and twice as suffocating. He gestured toward the door of the motel room, a weathered piece of wood with the number 12 hanging crookedly from a single rusted screw. My white dress was a glaring beacon in the darkness, a ridiculous costume that belonged to a world that was now miles and lifetimes away. I realized then that I was not afraid of him, but of my own heart. He pulled a heavy brass key from his pocket and stepped past me to unlock the door, the metal grinding against metal with a harsh sound that echoed through the parking lot. The door swung open on complaining hinges, revealing a room that was dimly lit by the flickering blue glow of a television that had been left on with the volume turned down. The light danced across the peeling wallpaper and the stained carpet, creating a landscape of shadows and highlights that felt like something out of a fever dream. I followed him inside, the hem of my gown dragging through the dust of the threshold as the door clicked shut behind us, sealing us away from the rest of the world. The room smelled of stale air and the faint, lingering scent of cheap cleaning fluid, a sharp contrast to the luxury I had been surrounded by only hours before. Marcus stood in the center of the space, his back to me, his hands resting on his hips as he surveyed the modest surroundings with an expression I could not quite read. I stood by the bed, the mattress looking lumpy and uninviting under its faded polyester spread, and felt a sudden pang of nostalgia for the simplicity of our youth. Back then, a room like this would have been a palace of possibilities. Now it was a battlefield where the lines between love and hate were beginning to blur into a single smear. I looked at his hands, those large, capable hands that had built an empire, and then used that same power to destroy my wedding day without a second thought. I knew that if I wanted to, I could run out that door and scream for help, and eventually the world of David and my parents would come to rescue me. Nor the thought of returning to that gilded cage, to a life of hollow smiles, felt like a far worse fate than whatever Marcus had planned for me in this derelict motel. He knew the parts of me that I had tried so hard to bury, the anger, the hunger, and the deep, abiding loneliness that David could never even hope to understand. This man knew my soul. The flickering neon sign outside the window pulsed like a dying heart, casting rhythmic waves of crimson light across the peeling wallpaper of the motel room. It turned our small, cramped sanctuary into a landscape of shadows and blood, where the ordinary rules of the civilized world seemed to dissolve into the stale, heavy air. I stood frozen in the center of the space, watching the red glow catch the edges of Marcus's silhouette, until he looked like a figure carved from the very darkness itself. Every pulse of the light revealed a new detail, a cracked mirror, a stained rug, yet all I could focus on was the predatory heat radiating from him in the silence. The scent of the room was a heavy, suffocating mixture of ancient dust, and the sharp, chemical bite of cheap lemon detergent that lingered in the fabric of the curtains. It was a sensory assault that stripped away the lingering smell of expensive lilies and the saccharine sweetness of the wedding cake I had left behind. This place was honest in its decay, a stark contrast to the polished lies of the estate that had been my prison for the last several months. I could feel the grit of the floor beneath my satin heels, a tactile reminder that I was no longer a princess in a tower but a woman standing on the edge of a dangerous, beautiful precipice. Marcus moved toward me with a slow, deliberate grace that made the air in my lungs feel thick and entirely uncooperative as he closed the distance between us. He reached out, his large hands catching the tattered remnants of my lace veil that still clung to my hair like a broken, useless spiderweb from another life. With a sharp, sudden motion, he tore the delicate fabric away, the sound of ripping silk echoing through the silence of the room like a muffled gunshot. It was a gesture of absolute reclamation, a violent stripping away of the identity I had tried so hard to inhabit for the sake of a comfortable, colorless future. The touch was almost painful in its underlying tenderness, a paradox that sent a jolt of raw, unfiltered electricity through my nervous system and made my knees weak. His knuckles brushed against my cheek, and the contrast was a visual shock that stole my breath away. His skin was the color of deep, rich obsidian against my own porcelain-white complexion. It was a collision of two worlds that had been kept apart by walls of prejudice and privilege, now meeting in this forgotten room. I felt the calluses on his palms, a testament to the hard life he had built while I was busy being groomed for a life of submission. "Did you really think I would let you disappear into that white void, Emily?" he asked, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that seemed to resonate deep within my own ribcage. He spoke the words as if they were a challenge, a demand for me to acknowledge the suffocating emptiness of the life I had almost accepted for myself. His breath was warm against my face, smelling of the bitter tobacco and summer rain I had remembered from our final season together so many years ago. I looked up at him, my eyes tracing the hard lines of his face in the flickering red light, and I realized that he was the only person who understood. I saw the flickering ghosts of our shared past in the depths of his dark eyes, the anger of being excluded, the hunger of being ignored, and the fierce love that had never died. This moment was an act of revenge against a society that had tried to erase his existence, but it was also something much deeper and more terrifying than simple spite. It was an act of salvation, a brutal rescue mission to pull me back from a death of the spirit before the ink on the marriage license could even dry. I felt the weight of his gaze pinning me to the spot, stripping away every defense I had spent 7 years constructing. The old air conditioning unit in the window let out a long metallic groan, a rhythmic rattling that provided a desperate soundtrack to the frantic pounding of my heart. It blew a stream of cold, dusty air across my bare shoulders, making the ivory silk of my wedding dress cling to my curves like a second, unwanted skin. I was hyper-aware of everything in that moment, the texture of the cheap polyester bedspread, the hum of the neon sign, and the overwhelming physical presence of the man standing inches away. The world outside the walls of room 12 had ceased to exist, leaving only the two of us in the dark. My gown felt like a heavy, cumbersome lie, a fortress of fabric designed to protect a virtue that had already been surrendered to the memory of him a long time ago. Every stitch of lace and every pearl bead seemed to mock me in the red-tinted gloom, representing the thousands of dollars spent to buy a piece that I never actually desired. I could feel the cold metal of the zipper at my back, a line that felt like a scar, and I found myself wishing for the strength to tear it all away. Marcus seemed to sense my inner turmoil, his gaze dropping to the swell of my chest as my breathing grew faster and more erratic. He reached out again, his dark fingers splaying across the stark whiteness of my shoulder, and the sight of it made my head swim with a sudden violent sense of vertigo. It was the most honest thing I had ever seen. The undeniable reality of our bodies meeting in the darkness without the interference of lawyers, parents, or social expectations. The warmth of his hand seeped through the thin silk, a searing heat that made my skin tingle with a forbidden anticipation I could no longer deny. I was a study in contrasts, a white-clad bride in the arms of the man the world told me to fear, and I had never felt more alive. The rational world, with its spreadsheets and social calendars and polite dinner conversations, was crumbling into ash at my feet like a burnt offering to a forgotten god. I thought of David standing in the middle of our perfect living room, and realized that he was merely a ghost, a hollow shell of a man compared to the visceral reality of Marcus. The guilt I expected to feel was entirely absent, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity that cut through the fog of my previous existence. I had been playing a part for so long that I had forgotten the sound of my own voice, but in this room I was finally beginning to remember. This was the point of no return, the moment where the bridge behind me was finally engulfed in flames, leaving me stranded in this beautiful, terrifying territory of his making. Every second that passed in this motel room was another nail in the coffin of my reputation, another step away from the safety of the suburbs. I knew that the people I had called friends would view this as a tragedy, a kidnapping, or a violation of the highest order. But as I looked at Marcus, I knew that the only real violation would be to go back to the life that had been slowly killing me one day at a time for 7 years. There was something primal and ancient in the way we stood there, a connection that bypassed the intellect and spoke directly to the blood running through our veins. It was a hunger that had been suppressed for too long, fed by occasional glimpses of each other across crowded rooms and the cold headlines in the business newspapers. We were two predators who had finally found each other again in the dark, and the air between us was thick with the scent of a storm that had been brewing since we were children. I could see the pulse jumping in his neck, a rhythmic proof of the desire he was trying to control. I did not wait for him to make the next move. I could no longer endure the agonizing distance of those few inches that separated our bodies and our destinies. I stepped forward, the silk of my heavy skirts rustling like a warning as I closed the gap and pressed my body against the solid, unyielding heat of his chest. It was a voluntary surrender, a conscious choice to embrace the chaos he represented, and to reject the hollow order of the world I had left behind. When my hands finally touched the lapels of his suit, I felt a shudder go through his massive frame, a sign that his iron control was breaking. His arms came around me like a landslide, crushing me against him with a strength that was both terrifying and intoxicating in its absolute possessiveness. I buried my face in the crook of his neck, breathing in the scent of leather, expensive tobacco, and rain until there was no room in my lungs for anything else. The roughness of his suit against my cheek and the power of his grip made me feel small and protected for the first time in my life. This was the dark and honest place we had created together in our youth, a sanctuary built of shared secrets, broken rules, and the heavy weight of our mutual longing. I realized then that I was not being held by a captor, but by the only person who had ever truly known the location of my home and the secrets of my heart. It was not in a mansion in Chicago or a summer house in Maine, but here in the shadow of a man who loved me with a ferocity that bordered on madness. This sin, this betrayal of everything I was supposed to be, was the only truth I had left in a world made of polished lies and expensive facades. As the red neon light continued to pulse against my closed eyelids, I felt the last of my resistance drain away, leaving only the raw reality. The hum of the air conditioner faded into the background, replaced by the sound of our synchronized breathing in the heavy, expectant silence of the motel room. I knew that the sun would eventually rise and the world would demand a frantic explanation for my disappearance from the wedding, but for now, the night belonged to us. There were no more words needed. No more explanations required for the dark path we had taken to reach this moment of absolute clarity. In the flickering crimson gloom of room 12, the bride had finally vanished, and the woman had found her way back to the heart of the storm. I could feel the pressure of his heartbeat against my own, a heavy and steady rhythm that seemed to drown out the echoes of the life I had just abandoned at the altar. Every breath we shared in the darkness was a secret, a pact written in the silence of the room and the heat of our intertwined shadows. The ivory silk of my dress was now nothing more than a ruined relic of a dead future, a costume that no longer fit the woman I had become in his arms. We were anchored to each other in a sea of red light, two souls finally reclaiming the ground that had been stolen from us by time and circumstance. As I leaned back to look into his eyes, I saw the reflection of a woman I finally recognized, someone who was no longer afraid of the dark or the consequences of her own desires. The world would call this a crime, a scandal that would be whispered about for years in the hallowed halls of our social circles, but to me it was the only mercy I had ever known. I reached up to touch his face, my pale fingers tracing the line of his jaw with a reverence that required no spoken vows. In the quiet of that room we were rewriting the ending of our story, one heartbeat and one shadow at a time. 3 hours had bled into the dark fabric of the night, leaving me transformed in ways the world could not yet see or understand. The black SUV glided to a silent halt before the towering iron gates of the estate, its engine ticking with a rhythmic, cooling heat that felt like a secret pact between the machine and the road. I sat in the plush darkness of the rear seat, my heart a heavy, slow-moving weight in a chest that still felt the phantom burning pressure of Marcus's touch. The transition from the derelict motel to the opulence of the driveway was a jarring, violent shift in reality that made my vision swim with a strange, emerald vertigo. I looked out at the mansion, where every window was ablaze with a golden, aggressive light that seemed to mock the shadows I was currently hiding in. The sound of a live band drifted through the humid air, the upbeat tempo of a jazz standard clashing with the slow, primal drumbeat still echoing in my ears from the motel. It was a palace of illusions, a structure built on the assumption that everything could be bought, sold, or polished into a state of perfection. To the hundreds of guests inside, time had likely stood still, a brief interval of celebration while the bride was tucked away for a traditional, harmless game. Marcus did not turn around to look at me, but I could see his eyes in the rearview mirror, two dark pools of knowing that anchored me to the present moment. There were no parting words, no whispered promises of a future meeting, because the air between us was already saturated with the weight of what had transpired in room 12. The silence was our final pact, a heavy and unbreakable agreement that the last 3 hours belonged to a dimension that David and his world could never hope to enter. I reached for the door handle, my fingers brushing the cool metal with a sense of profound, icy detachment that chilled my blood. When I stepped out into the night, the humid breeze caught the ruined remnants of my silk gown, making the fabric swirl around my legs like a tattered white flag of surrender. The ivory hem was stained with the gray dust of the roadside and the dark oil of the parking lot, a map of my transgression written in filth against the pristine silk. My hair, once pinned into a rigid and elegant crown, now fell across my shoulders in a wild, tangled mess that smelled of rain and tobacco. I felt like a creature emerging from the dark woods, blinking at the bright lights of a civilization that no longer made any sense to me. I walked toward the grand entrance, my heels clicking on the stones with a sound that felt like a countdown to an inevitable explosion that never quite came. The towering oak doors stood open, spilling the scent of expensive perfume and roasted meats into the garden, a sensory reminder of the life I was supposed to be leading. I paused at the threshold, smoothing the wrinkled silk over my hips with trembling hands, trying to summon the mask of the bride once more before I was seen. The adrenaline of the crime was still coursing through my veins, giving me a predatory clarity that made my surroundings look like a theater set. Inside, the ballroom was a swirling vortex of motion and noise, a kaleidoscope of tuxedoed men and women in shimmering gowns who were entirely oblivious to the change in the air. The smell of top-shelf gin and wilting lilies hit me like a physical wall, thick and cloying enough to make my stomach churn with a sudden sharp nausea. No one stopped to stare, and no one gasped at my disheveled state. They were all too intoxicated by the music and the free-flowing alcohol to notice the dirt on my hem. I moved through the crowd like a ghost, a silent witness to the shallow pageantry of my own wedding ceremony. David appeared out of the golden haze of the dance floor, his face flushed with a mixture of excitement and expensive scotch as he pushed through the throng toward me. He was holding a crystal flute of champagne that caught the light with a blinding, fractured brilliance, his smile wide and utterly devoid of any suspicion. To him, I was merely the final piece of the evening's entertainment, the prize that had been returned after a harmless traditional kidnapping by his boisterous friends. He saw the mess I had become and interpreted it through the lens of a playful game, his blindness a perfect shield for my secret. "Oh, you guys really went all out with the roleplay, didn't you?" he exclaimed, his voice booming over the sound of the trumpets as he reached out to pull me into his personal space. "Who was the one who dragged you through the garden?" he asked with a laugh, his eyes sweeping over my wrinkled dress and the tangled mess of my hair with a disturbing lack of insight. He was so convinced of his own reality, so certain of the script he had written for our lives, that he could not see the woman standing right in front of him. I felt a surge of cold, dark pity for the man I was now bound to by the laws of God and man. I forced my lips to curve into a smile that felt brittle and foreign, a mask of glass that threatened to shatter at any moment under the weight of his oblivious gaze. I allowed him to wrap his arm around my waist, his hand pressing against the very spot where Marcus had held me only an hour before with a terrifying, beautiful intensity. The contrast was almost unbearable, a shallow imitation of a touch that had once threatened to consume me entirely in the dark of that motel. I nodded and laughed at his jokes, playing the part of the slightly ruffled bride with a precision that would have made a professional actress weep. He leaned down to kiss me, his lips smelling of bubbles and sugar, a saccharine sweetness that made me want to pull away and scream into the crowded room. As his mouth pressed against mine, I could still taste the bitter smoke and the raw, salt-heavy heat of the man who had actually taken me into the night. It was a moment of supreme psychological torture, a collision of two vastly different worlds within the small space of a single kiss. I stood there, rooted to the spot, feeling like a double agent who had successfully infiltrated the enemy's camp, while the battle was still raging in the distance of my soul. I felt a strange, intoxicating sense of triumph blooming in the center of my chest, a bitter and joyful heat that had nothing to do with the man currently holding me. It was the feeling of a criminal who had committed the perfect heist in broad daylight, standing among the investigators while the stolen jewels were hidden in plain sight. Every guest who complimented my beauty and every relative who toasted our future was a witness to my success in maintaining the illusion of the perfect life. I was happy with a dark, twisted satisfaction that I knew would never leave me, a secret fire that would warm me through the years. The evening continued in a blur of forced conversations and repetitive dances, a slow-motion parade of social obligations that felt increasingly surreal as the clock ticked toward midnight. I moved through the rituals with a mechanical grace, my mind constantly wandering back to the quiet of room 12 and the sound of the highway wind. I was hyper-aware of the dirt under my fingernails and the way the lace of my bodice felt slightly tighter than it had been in the morning. Every physical sensation was a tether to the truth, a hidden weight that anchored me to the reality of what I had done in the deep shadows. At one point, I found myself standing alone near a buffet table, the silver platters of oysters and caviar looking like cold, gray stones under the harsh glare of the ballroom lights. I reached up, my fingers moving instinctively to the base of my neck where the lace collar of my dress met the sensitive skin of my throat. Beneath the delicate fabric, I could feel a faint, throbbing heat where Marcus's fingers had left their mark, a secret bruise that burned like a brand of ownership. It was an invisible scar that I would carry with me into the bedroom of my husband, a silent witness to a betrayal that was also a liberation. I watched David across the room, laughing with his father as they discussed some business merger that would likely triple their family fortune within the next fiscal year. He looked so comfortable in his skin, so entirely unaware of the tectonic shift that had occurred within the foundation of his marriage before it had even truly begun. He believed he possessed me, that he had bought my loyalty with the diamond ring on my finger, and the name he had given me at the altar. He would never know that I had already given the best parts of myself to the man he considered an unrefined intruder in his polished, perfect world. As the final song of the night began to play, a slow and sentimental ballad that made the older couple sway with a practiced, tired affection, I felt a sudden and profound sense of peace. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape that was ruined but honest, a world where I finally knew the price of my own freedom. I leaned my head against David's shoulder as we moved across the floor, closing my eyes and imagining the black SUV disappearing into the infinite distance of the highway. The wedding was over, the guests were leaving, and the game had been won by the player who was never invited to the table. I walked toward the grand staircase for our final departure, the train of my dress whispering across the marble one last time as we prepared to leave for our honeymoon. The air was cooling down, but the heat under my skin remained, a constant and quiet reminder of the man who was currently driving away into his own empire of shadows. I knew that I would spend the rest of my life playing this part, wearing the pearls and the smiles while the memory of the motel room lived in the dark corners of my mind. It was a heavy burden, but as I looked at David's oblivious face, I knew I would carry it. We stepped out into the night air, the cameras of the remaining photographers flashing like a final, staccato pulse of artificial lightning against the dark Chicago sky. David waved to the crowd, his arm around me in a gesture of absolute victory, while I stared into the lens with a gaze that I hoped looked like bridal bliss. In reality, I was looking past the flashes and the cheers, searching for a pair of headlights that were not there, a sign of the man who had stolen me and then given me back. The door of the limousine clicked shut, sealing us in a tomb of leather and luxury, and I began my lie. 9 months is a long time to hold one's breath, while living inside a masterpiece of architectural deception. The seasons shifted outside our floor-to-ceiling windows, turning the lush greens of the Chicago summer into the brittle skeletal grays of an unforgiving winter. I watched the frost crawl across the glass in slow, crystalline patterns, tracing the delicate, icy veins with a finger that felt increasingly disconnected from the rest of my body. Inside our home, the air was always a perfect 68 degrees, smelling of expensive beeswax and the faint clinical citrus of organic cleaners. It was a beautiful airless tomb where my new life was supposed to be flourishing in the light. David was the architect of our domestic bliss, moving through our days with a terrifying, unwavering optimism that made my teeth ache with unspoken resentment. He spoke of our future as if it were a blueprint already approved by a divine committee, a series of milestones involving property values and prestigious preschool applications. To him, our marriage was a successful investment that was finally beginning to yield its most significant dividend in the form of an heir. He would often come home with sketches for a new wing of the mansion, his eyes bright with the fever of expansion, never noticing that I was shrinking into the shadows of the very rooms he sought to enlarge. I became a creature of silence, a ghost haunting the edges of my own existence, while my body performed the miraculous and terrifying task of creation. I spent hours sitting by the window that overlooked the long winding driveway, my gaze fixed on the spot where the black SUV had once disappeared into the night. Every pair of headlights that swept across the lawn in the evening caused a violent, hopeful jolt in my chest, a physiological reaction that I could not suppress no matter how hard I tried. I was waiting for a storm that never arrived, trapped in the stagnant calm of a life that felt like a beautifully decorated waiting room for a destination I could not name. In the quiet hours when David was at the office, my mind would unfailingly drift back to the flickering red neon of room 12, the memories becoming more vivid as the weeks passed. I could still feel the phantom weight of Marcus's hands on my skin, a searing contrast to the polite and measured affection that David offered me every night. The smell of tobacco and rain would occasionally manifest in my mind with such intensity that I would gasp for air, my senses rebelling against the sterile reality of my surroundings. That single night had become the sun around which my entire universe now orbited, a dark and burning center that provided the only warmth I truly recognized. I knew a truth that was as sharp and jagged as a piece of broken glass hidden in a bowl of sugar, and that secret was the only thing that kept me from dissolving into the wallpaper. While David spent his evenings highlighting catalogs of designer nursery furniture, I was busy memorizing the curve of a different man's jaw and the resonant growl of a voice that had claimed me in the dark. This knowledge was a hidden weapon, a silent power that I cradled against my ribs like a stolen jewel. It gave me the strength to endure the tedious Sunday brunches and the hollow conversations with women who measured their worth in the carats of their wedding rings. David eventually began to bring home small blue knit booties, placing them on the mantel like holy relics of his own masculine pride and ancestral continuity. He had spent an entire afternoon debating whether we should name our son after his grandfather the senator or his great-uncle the federal judge. The names felt heavy and dusty in the air, like old library books that no one ever actually intended to read or understand. I would merely nod and offer a thin, practiced smile, my hands draped over the rising curve of my stomach where a different rhythm was already beginning to take hold. I could feel the child moving inside me, a wild and restless energy that felt nothing like the man who sat across from me. The physical transformation of my body was a constant source of wonder to David, who viewed my pregnancy as a biological confirmation of his own excellence and virility. He would press his ear to my belly, whispering promises of trust funds and Ivy League educations to a being he believed he had fathered in the comfort of our silk sheets. I would look down at the back of his head, feeling a surge of dark, twisted pity for the depth of his delusion. He was building a kingdom on a foundation of sand, entirely unaware that the heir he was so desperately waiting for carried the genetic code of his greatest rival. The irony was a bitter, intoxicating wine that I drank in secret every single day. As the 9th month approached, the psychological tension in the house reached a fever pitch, hidden carefully behind a facade of gourmet meals and expensive gifts. Every time David touched me, I felt a creeping sensation of skin-crawling revulsion, a visceral reaction to the lie we were both living. He interpreted my withdrawal as the natural fatigue of an expectant mother, hovering over me with an annoying, stifling concern that made me want to scream into the silence of the hallways. The nursery was finished now, a pale blue sanctuary of soft fabrics and silver rattles that felt like a stage set for a play that was about to take a very dark turn. I started to dream of the highway again, the sound of tires on wet asphalt, and the feeling of being taken away by a force that did not ask for permission. In these dreams, Marcus would come for me not in an SUV, but as a shadow that swallowed the entire mansion, erasing the crown molding and the marble floors with a single elegant stroke. I would wake up drenched in sweat, the baby kicking violently against my ribs as if he too were trying to escape the confines of our gilded cage. The silence of the house would press in on me, heavy and expectant, as if the very walls were waiting for the first cry of a child who would shatter everything. One afternoon, David insisted on showing me the completed portrait he had commissioned of us, a massive canvas that depicted a radiant, saint-like version of me and a protective, noble version of himself. It was a lie in oil paint, a visual representation of the life he wanted the world to see, and I had to lean against the wall to keep from laughing out loud at the absurdity of it. He looked at the painting with such profound satisfaction that I realized he was no longer capable of seeing reality at all. He had fallen in love with the image of us, a two-dimensional perfection that required no depth and no honesty to maintain. The movements of the baby became more pronounced, a primitive and powerful drumming that seemed to synchronize with the memories of that night in the motel. I could feel the strength in his limbs, a restless vitality that felt entirely alien to the soft, pampered world of the suburbs. It was as if a part of Marcus was already manifesting within me, a silent rebellion growing larger with every passing hour. I would sit in the rocking chair in the nursery, surrounded by the blue booties and the senators' names, and whisper a different name into the quiet air. It was a name that tasted of leather and rain, a name that belonged to the shadows. David's friends began to drop by with expensive bottles of whiskey to celebrate the impending arrival of the next generation of their social circle. They sat in the library, their voices loud and confident as they discussed the stock market and the upcoming gala season, their laughter echoing through the vents. I stayed in my room, listening to the muffled sounds of their merriment, and feeling a profound sense of detachment from the entire species. They were all so certain of their place in the world, so convinced that the rules they had written would protect them from the chaos that was currently brewing in my womb. I felt like a ticking clock in a room full of people who had forgotten that time existed. The final week was a blur of physical discomfort, and a mounting sense of dread that was strangely intertwined with a fierce, protective joy. I stopped pretending to be interested in the names or the nursery decor, retreating into a mental space where only the red neon and the smell of tobacco existed. David grew increasingly nervous, his practiced composure beginning to fray at the edges as the reality of the impending birth finally started to sink in. He paced the hallways at night, his footsteps a rhythmic reminder of the life he was trying so hard to control. We were both waiting for the same event, but for entirely different reasons. I stood in front of the mirror on the final evening, looking at the stranger I had become over the last 9 months of silence and secrecy. My skin was glowing with a strange, pale light, and my eyes held a depth of knowledge that made me look years older than the girl who had worn the ivory silk. I reached out and touched my reflection, my fingers tracing the line of my throat where the invisible mark of Marcus's fingers had once burned. The lie was almost complete. The masterpiece of deception was nearly ready for its grand unveiling. I felt a sudden sharp pain in my lower back, a signal that the long wait was finally coming to an end. The first contraction hit me like a wave of dark water, pulling me under and washing away the last remnants of the life I had been faking. I did not call for David immediately. Instead, I sat in the dark and leaned into the pain, welcoming the violence of the sensation. It was the first honest thing I had felt since the night of the wedding, a physical manifestation of the truth that could no longer be contained within my body. The house remained silent, the blue nursery waited in the shadows, and the gold-framed portrait stared blindly into the hall. The time for names and legacies was over. The time for the blood and the truth had finally arrived. By the time the sun began to rise over the frozen lake, the world of the mansion had been transformed into a frantic scene of medical bags and hushed, urgent whispers. David was hovering by the door, his face a mask of pale anxiety as he watched the professionals take over the space he had so carefully curated. I was no longer the bride or the socialite. I was merely a vessel for a force that was determined to be born into a world that was not ready for it. Every breath was a struggle, every wave of pain a step closer to the moment when the silence would finally be exploded by the cry of a child who belonged to the night. The lighting in the private clinic was an aggressive clinical white that seemed to strip away every shadow and secret I had carefully harbored for 9 long months. It was a sterile, unforgiving brightness that bounced off the polished tile floors and the chrome railings of the bed, creating a world without depth or mercy. I felt the sweat drying on my forehead, a cold and salty residue of the hours of labor that had finally reached their crescendo in this high-priced sanctuary of modern medicine. The air smelled of sharp antiseptic and the faint, underlying metallic scent of blood, a sensory combination that grounded me in the raw reality of the moment I had been anticipating. David stood by the window, his silhouette etched against the rising sun that was beginning to bleed over the horizon of the city. He looked like the hero of a story that was about to be irrevocably rewritten, his posture rigid with an expectant, nervous pride that was almost painful to witness. Every few seconds he would glance at the door, his eyes bright with the anticipation of meeting the heir he believed would carry his name and his legacy into the next generation. He was so entirely unaware of the storm that was currently making its way across the room in the arms of the midwife, a man holding onto a ghost of a reality that was already dissolving into the bright morning air. The heavy silence of the room was interrupted only by the rhythmic, mechanical hum of the monitoring equipment and the distant, muffled sounds of the hospital corridor. I felt a strange, detached sense of peace settling over me, a psychological numbness that allowed me to observe the unfolding scene as if I were a spectator at my own coronation. My hands were trembling slightly as I reached for the edge of the crisp white sheets, the fabric feeling unnaturally smooth and cold against my skin. There was a fly trapped against the window pane, its frantic buzzing against the glass the only honest sound in a space designed to stifle and contain the messiness of life. When the midwife finally approached the bed, she carried the small bundled weight with a reverence that felt like a heavy physical pressure against my chest. She did not speak, and her face remained a professional mask of neutral efficiency, yet there was a subtle hesitation in her movement that told me everything I needed to know before I even saw him. The air in the room seemed to vanish, leaving us in a vacuum of expectation where every heartbeat felt like a hammer blow against my ribs. I looked at the bundle of soft blue cotton and felt a surge of electric, primitive recognition that bypassed my mind and went straight to the deepest part of my soul. She lowered the child into my arms, and for a long moment, the world simply ceased to turn, leaving us suspended in a frozen fragment of time that belonged to no calendar. The baby was strong and healthy, his presence filling the sterile space with a visceral, pulsing energy that made the expensive surroundings look like cardboard props. I looked down at his face and saw the unmistakable features of the man who had stolen me from my own wedding and given me back to a life of lies. My son had skin the color of warm, dark honey, a beautiful and defiant contrast to the pale ivory of the sheets and the sterile whiteness of the room that was supposed to be his first home. His eyes opened for a brief second, revealing 2 dark, intelligent pools that already held the same commanding, obsidian fire I had seen in Marcus's gaze during our night at the motel. There was an innate power in the way he gripped my finger with his small, powerful hand, a silent declaration of a heritage that could not be hidden or negotiated away by any lawyers. He was a masterpiece of biological truth, a living testament to the 3 hours that had redefined my entire existence and shattered the foundation of my marriage. I felt a fierce, burning love for him that was inextricably intertwined with the dark romance of his origin, a feeling that was a secret victory. David moved from the window, his footsteps light and eager as he approached the bed to greet the son he had already named after a long line of white, influential ancestors. I watched the transformation of his face as he leaned over us, the practiced smile of the proud father beginning to falter and dissolve into a mask of pure, unadulterated confusion. He stopped mid-step, his hand frozen in the air as his eyes swept over the child's dark skin and the familiar curve of his features. The transition was agonizingly slow, a psychological landslide that buried his expectations beneath a mountain of undeniable, physical reality that he could not rationalize away. The color drained from his cheeks until he was the same sickly, translucent shade as the hospital walls, his mouth hanging open in a silent, desperate attempt to find words that no longer existed. He looked at me, then back at the baby, and then at me again, his gaze searching for some explanation, some trick of the light that would restore the world he had understood only moments before. He was like a man standing on the edge of a cliff, watching the ground beneath his feet crumble into the sea, unable to grasp the magnitude of the disaster that had just overtaken him. The silence in the room became so heavy and absolute that the sound of the fly against the glass seemed deafening. I watched him with a cold, detached fascination, feeling a sense of triumph that was as sharp and intoxicating as a double shot of the finest bourbon. Every second of his silence was a victory for me, a slow-motion demolition of the arrogance and the privilege that had governed our lives since the day we were born. He was seeing the ruins of his perfect family tree, the branches snapped and the roots poisoned by a truth that he had been too blind and too self-absorbed to notice. I felt a surge of dark, triumphant energy flowing through my veins, a feeling of absolute liberation that made the physical pain of the last several months seem like a small and necessary price to pay. His face changed from a deathly pale to a deep mottled purple as the realization of my betrayal finally took hold of his consciousness with a violent, suffocating grip. I could see the rage simmering just beneath the surface of his skin, but it was a helpless, impotent anger that had nowhere to go in the face of the biological evidence cradled in my arms. He was a broken man, a hollow shell of the golden boy who had kissed my shoulder in the mansion and believed he owned my heart by virtue of a marriage license. The social superiority he had worn like a cloak for 25 years had been stripped away, leaving him naked and shivering in the bright, clinical light of the clinic. I pulled the baby closer to my chest, feeling the warmth of his body against mine as a shield against the cold, silent fury radiating from the man standing at the foot of my bed. I did not flinch and I did not look away. I wanted him to see the happiness in my eyes, the bitter and beautiful joy of a woman who had finally found her own way out of the cage. My son was the key to my freedom, a permanent and visible mark of my rebellion that would haunt David and his family for the rest of their natural lives. The power dynamic of our marriage had shifted in an instant, and I was the one who now held the ultimate authority over our shared ruined history. I looked him directly in the eyes, my gaze steady and unyielding as I prepared to deliver the final crushing blow to the world he had spent his entire life trying to preserve. I felt the name rising in my throat, a single word that carried the weight of 7 years of longing and 3 hours of absolute, forbidden passion in a roadside motel. It was more than just a name. It was a confession, a declaration of war, and a final act of devotion to the only man who had ever truly known my soul. I could feel the silence in the room stretching to the breaking point, a psychological wire that was about to snap and release the truth into the air like a lethal, invisible gas. His name is Marcus, I said, my voice clear and resonant, slicing through the heavy atmosphere of the clinic with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. I spoke the words slowly, savoring the way the syllables felt on my tongue, and the way they seemed to vibrate through the very walls of the hospital room. David flinched as if I had struck him across the face, his eyes widening with a sudden sharp realization that the name was not a random choice but a deliberate and calculated insult. In that one moment I claimed my child for the shadows he came from and rejected the light of the suburbs once and for all, leaving the golden boy with nothing but the echoes of my voice. It was my ultimate triumph. A masterpiece of revenge that had been meticulously painted over the course of 9 months of silence and deception. I felt the weight of his expectations falling away from me, the blue booties and the names of senators becoming nothing more than dust in the wind of my own liberation. I was happy, with a dark and vengeful satisfaction that made my heart feel full and heavy in a way it had never been during my years of polite submission. I had won the game that no one else even knew we were playing, and the prize was the beautiful honey-skinned boy who was currently sleeping in my arms, oblivious to the war he had just ended. I looked past David at the city skyline, where the morning sun was now fully visible, casting a golden light over the world that I was finally ready to face on my own terms. The mansion, the social circles, and the empty promises of our marriage were all ruins now, scattered remains of a life that had never been truly mine to begin with. I was free, and my son was the living proof of that freedom, a truth that was now etched into our very DNA, and could never be erased by time or circumstance. I closed my eyes and breathed in the scent of the child, feeling the dark romance of our origin story finally coming to its perfect, inevitable, and utterly devastating conclusion. As the room settled into a new kind of silence, one filled with the weight of the irrevocable, I knew that the world would never be the same for any of us after this day. David would have to live with the knowledge of his own inadequacy, and I would have to live with the consequences of my own fierce and dangerous choices. But as I felt the steady heartbeat of the baby against my own, I knew that I would not change a single second of the journey that had brought us to this clinical white room. We were the victors in this noir tale of love and betrayal, and the ruins of the life I had left behind were the only throne I ever truly wanted to sit upon in the end.